Truthfully, what happens is, as children grow up, we start to educate them progressively from the waist up. And then we focus on their heads and slightly to one side.
I think in the old days, you were better off. Because nowadays, they're all specialists. Everyone's becoming better and better. And less and less. And eventually someone's going to be superb. And nothing.
Our education system has mined our minds in the way that we strip mined the earth for a particular commodity. And for the future, it won't serve us. We have to rethink the fundamental principles on which we're educating our children.
We're not here to tell everybody that they're wrong and we're right. We're not saying that we have all the answers, but we'd like to present a different way of looking at it.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to China Jeducation, episode 37. My name is Andy Christian, and I am a researcher at Teach Now in Washington, D.C.
Not just a researcher, though, Andy, a data researcher, and a very good one at that.
Well, thank you for saying so, Chris. Yeah, we like to delve into the numbers so that we have a really good sense of what we're talking about.
You have a little bit of a unique background because you've spent a lot of time in China. Indeed, you've grown up there for a good part of your life. So we're going to be talking about that and your experience there, and specifically to do with teaching. And we're also going to loop that back into the great work that you're doing at Teach Now at this moment. So as a data researcher, or as I've seen on your website, the Teach Now website, Andy, an institutional and marketing researcher, very interesting. I've never heard that one before. What's the actual things that you do?
Well, we're still really a pretty small company. We're a startup. And as is typical in many startup situations, you sort of wear a lot of hats. You do a lot of different jobs that are necessary as they come up. So essentially my role as a researcher, however you want to term it, is just to look into the information both reactively and proactively that we need to gather more information on to further enhance our capacity to deliver this great program to our candidates.
Right. And funny, I didn't realize Teach Now was still in that startup phase. I mean, you guys really took off, having interviewed your CEO, Emily Feist-Stritz, around 2014. You've had super growth, of course, gazelle-like, gargantuan growth. But I guess I can see, why you still are in the startup stage. So real interesting times. And you've recently, if I'm right, have just done a big survey, haven't you, to your thousands of teachers that have gone through your system, me included, of course. And so you must have had some real numbers and data to crunch there, Andy.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a really fascinating project to work on for me. It was my first time to do a proper sort of deep data dive. I've worked with a lot of reports that people have published of their own research, but it was my first time to conduct that kind of research of the data myself. And we found a lot of things that we weren't necessarily seeking to find that surprised us, that I think speaks to not just what's going on with the candidates in our program, but sort of where the education world is and the global reality of that world.
Interesting stuff. And, maybe in the future we can, I like how you said data dive. You make it sound so sexy, diving into data.
Well, you got to spice it up somehow.
Yeah, spice it up indeed. So maybe we can dive into that data at some point in the future. That sounds it sounds quite fun. Now, let's talk China.
Yes.
Because now you're in Washington, D.C., of course, in the Teach Now office. But as I alluded to earlier, you have spent a lot of time in China. So tell us what brought you to China, Andy, in the first place. And go into that, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So China has been a very significant part of my life and continues to be so. When I was a kid, when I was 10, my family moved there. My Dad was involved in a software company. They did some of the early JavaScript applications for the internet, for websites. They developed some of that technology. And so my family lived in China, in the city of Tianjin, which is just southeast of Beijing. I lived there from the ages of 10 to 18, and really in many ways in part Chinese, just from growing up and being surrounded by the culture. And it, at the very least, had a very significant influence on my perspectives and my development. So yeah, I grew up there as a kid, and that interest stayed with me. And I went to college a few times, but the third time, when I finally graduated, I studied East Asian studies with a focus on China. And that took me back to China for language study and other visits. And most recently, last year, I spent a year teaching English at a university in Zhengzhou.
Okay. Uh-huh. Wow, that is an interesting story. And China therefore runs deep. So
yeah,
when you're a 10-year-old boy and you arrived in China with your mum and dad, do you have siblings?
I did. Yeah, I'm the youngest of four.
Okay.
So my older siblings, it was a more difficult transition for them because they were teenagers and such.
Yeah.
But for me at 10, it was just kind of an exciting adventure. It was at that age where I was old enough to understand what was going on, but young enough to be excited about being in a new spot.
So when that happened, what year are we talking about then? Because China's changing so much, isn't it?
Absolutely.
You're gonna give your age away here, aren't you, Andy? But
right.
Who cares about that?
Yeah. So yeah, no, that's a really great point about how much it has changed. So I moved there for the first time in 1996, and then when I graduated high school, that was 2004, and within that 8-year time frame, China certainly changed significantly, but by many metrics, it was really about 2004 where some of the most significant changes occurred. And to my kind of amateur eye, I would say that there's been a major cultural shift, sort of in the way people live and the expectations they have, that really began in earnest sort of at that 2004-ish time frame. So China changed a lot while I was there, and that was interesting to see. But it's changed, I think, far more dramatically even since then.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I'm just thinking I rocked up on these shores around 2006.
Yeah.
So, and you in 1996.
Yeah.
And I mean, you were in America, family, 3 siblings, and what happened? When was it announced that you'd be going to live in Tianjin?
Right. Yeah. So it kind of was always something my dad had wanted to do. He had been a naval officer, and while he was on board ship in the early part of his career, he had done tours out there in Asia, and just kind of had always had a desire to go there and make a life there and just kind of see what things were about. So we knew for a few years as he went and, headed towards retirement that our plan was to head in that direction. So we, us kids probably were aware of the plan, 2 or 3 years in advance. And once he retired, we moved there. Yeah, in 96.
I'm thinking the internet came through, didn't it, in 1993? You said your dad was doing stuff in software. I mean, do you know any more about that? That just sounds really quite interesting as well. What could a man from America be doing with software in 1996 in Northeast China?
Yeah, those were certainly the early days in China for many expats. I would say there weren't too many folks there, even in the larger cities at that time. So he, with a number of friends, kind of put together a company, and they all had sort of programming or other kind of software backgrounds. And at that time, there was a guy in the company. I was young, so I don't necessarily know all of the details
Sure.
specifically, but the basic story would be there was a Australian guy actually in the company who was a really brilliant programmer, and basically was kind of ahead of the game on how JavaScript could be applied to web programming. And they actually, I mean, you never would have heard of their company. They sold their stuff to like Oracle and people like that. But they developed some of the first web-based applications for Java. So like nowadays, how we go to a website and we click the menu and it just drops down without reloading the page. That was the kind of stuff that they developed back in the late 90s, which at that time was pretty revolutionary for how websites operated. Yeah.
Oh, interesting stuff. So when you were there, obviously you needed to go to school. So were you put into what I can imagine like an international school? Would I be right in saying that? Or were you put into... Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's correct. So I, being that I was 10 and my siblings were older, going into a local school would have been a bit difficult for us.
Yeah,
we actually did consider that, but our parents sort of asked us, and we all kind of felt we'd rather go to an international school. So yes, I went to Tianjin International School, which is still operating now.
Great.
And as with international schools, particularly at that time, I realize it's changed some now, but at that time it was essentially all foreign expat kids. In a diverse group of them as well. There was quite a few different nationalities there. So aside from living abroad, kind of getting that international flavor had a huge impact on me for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, moving into those kind of middle school years, teenage years in China, I mean, if I could ask you, what was one thing that was like, wow, this is so different from back home? I mean, I'm sure we could spend hours talking about that, but what was the real big hitter for you, Andy?
I suppose that there wasn't anything. I think it's very different going there as an adult. Even as an adult going there last year, I had those kind of moments. But as a kid, I'm not sure there was something that struck me as so different in the sense that it was a difficult difference. But I think the thing that was most interesting to me, which perhaps has changed somewhat now, was sort of the market culture. The outdoor markets, which aren't really around so much anymore, but sort of just being able to go out into the market, and that was kind of where like the social gathering and the activity was, and just sort of peruse what was going on and all the wares. And I loved, getting into a bargain. I think the thing that probably was, especially in 96 and especially as a 10-year-old kid, that was maybe the most to adjust to, although from my perspective, it wasn't a negative thing, was all the attention. I received a lot of attention, especially when I tried to pull out my bargaining skills. And I think I got a number of good deals just because it was entertaining to people. But so that was an adjustment, I would say, was the sudden kind of focus, or almost sort of celebrity without being famous, right?
Yeah. And I mean, Tianjin, 96. It's not one of the big. It's not one of the big places. It's not your Beijing or your, your Canton or Guangzhou, Shanghai. So indeed, I can see that. Now, look, we could, as I said earlier, spend hours on this because it's really amazing and a very unique story of yours. But we must stay focused on education.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
You said earlier that when you went back to the States, I guess when you were 18, but then you've come back out here on a few separate occasions to study the Chinese Mandarin and to do various things. And you said you taught at a university. That's your the main teaching experience. And that was last year, was it, Andy?
It was just last year. I having this background in China, and if I were to be honest, having so much experience abroad, the U.S. has often felt like a foreign country to me as well, and is not necessarily where I feel most suited to live. So I wanted to explore the possibility of returning to China long term. So that's what brought me back to China last year, and teaching is one of the easier ways to get a visa. So that's the route I took, and that took me to Zhengzhou in Henan province.
Okay, yes, in Henan province, under Shaanxi and Shandong. Well, it's right in the middle of Shaanxi and Hubei as well, isn't it? Anhui, kind of in the central. Okay, so that's interesting. You said it, and of course now you're back in DC, doing data diving, as you said. Now, I know you've mentioned that there were things that you wish you knew but you didn't when you were teaching during that year. Sounds a great kind of name of a movie, but let's go through that if you can, because I think that'd be interesting. Things I wish I knew when I went to teach in China, but I didn't. So yeah, take that away, because that's a good one.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll preface it by saying that I didn't go into teaching in China without any sort of teaching background at all. It's never been my official position, so to speak, and I never had been a teacher in a classroom. But in various other occupations I've had, instruction has been an important aspect of that. And I did do a TEFL certification, obviously, as that's some sort of thing like that is generally required for a teaching position, particularly at a university. But the reality is despite having some experience, some background in instructing, and kind of having, I would say, a sort of natural knack for that kind of thing, teaching in a classroom, particularly a classroom of 40 to 60 students, which is the size that I had, is a very different situation. And despite having gone through a TEFL certification, that I felt I actually did a decent job of not just giving me some like education pointers, but they went through like lesson planning and that kind of stuff. So I felt like it had a decent preparation. But despite that, when I walked into a classroom of 40 to 60 students and was expected to significantly improve their oral English rather than just say memorizing some grammar, that proved to be a challenge that I immediately realized I was lacking some capability, some skills with. And there's a number of areas in which I noticed that. So probably one of the biggest things for me was some mixture of classroom logistics and or management. So it's not to say that I necessarily didn't know how to like keep order in the classroom or that kind of stuff. My previous employment, I knew how to do that kind of thing with groups. So it wasn't so much, like kids acting up and not knowing how to get them back on task. It was more of classroom management in the sense of I've got all these students, and spoken English is, again, not something you're just trying to memorize some points on. It's something that if you really want to develop a capacity for, you've got to engage, you've got to produce, you've got to practice, you've got to sort of bring it in a meaningful way to people's lives. So how to manage that size of a classroom and engage with them in instruction and activities that was actually going to benefit their improvement of and confidence in speaking English. So knowing how to manage that size and apply appropriate sort of activities and manage those activities and manage successful learning outcomes was something that was a struggle for me. And I came up with some ideas and did a whole bunch of Google research and that kind of stuff. But it was something that I consistently felt, anxiety over, and realized that if I had had a more formal and or effective preparation on that, I could have been a much better teacher for those students. So that kind of classroom logistics management piece was one thing. Another thing that was part and partial to the structure of the class, but also was something that I could have used more knowledge and skills with, was how to go about developing effective assessment tools for them. So again, it was a speaking class, so doing tests or something like that, or grammar tests or something like that, that didn't correlate to the goals of the class, right? So they already had other grammar classes, and in fact, their grammar and vocabulary and things like that weren't too bad. These were freshmen, many of them, so it could improve, but it wasn't too bad. But my class being a spoken English class, it's not going to do any good to have that style of assessment, because that's not the goal. So again, part of it had to do with the class being 40 to 60 students, which just makes everything difficult. But I struggled to come up effectively, especially on homework stuff, with assessments that would actually assess their level, assess what they were learning, and be able to be done in a way that I could actually, go through 40 to 60 answers and give them feedback. So again, the numbers made it particularly difficult, but I realized that I did not necessarily have the degree of preparation for developing assessments that would have been good to have.
Are you looking to further your career in education? Teach Now offers a convenient online teacher preparation and master's degree program completed anywhere in the world.
Reach now for Teach Now. Ain't no time for defeat now. Teachers get off your seats now. Future generations need you now.
Work with people all over the world in a collaborative, activity-based teaching environment.
To learn more, visit teach-now.edu.
Expertise that is really outside of the box.
Andy, I totally hearing you on a lot of this, actually, and I think probably a lot of the listeners, it will bring memories to their minds, whether they're in China or another international spot that they land on with a TEFL certificate. And as you said, these are all of the hurdles that a lot of us can pertain our experiences
absolutely.
to. So, okay, wonderful. I'm sure there's more, is there?
And I think, aside from just classroom specific things, I think one of the things that I perhaps a little hubris was involved, but I had mentioned I had gone to China wanting to see if it was somewhere I wanted to live long term. Yeah. And part of that is I had already lived the expat life as a kid. And as a kid, I really enjoyed living the expat life. But my goal in going back was to see how well I could integrate and live just sort of as another person locally. I didn't necessarily want to live the expat life, which is part of the reason I went to a city like Zhengzhou. So a little bit of hubris there was involved for me, in that I thought, I have this China background. I speak Mandarin pretty well. I understand the culture fairly well. But as it turned out, that wasn't necessarily the case, or there was a lot for me to learn about living there, especially about living more of a local style life. And with respect to the classroom, the culture of education is different. And I was aware of that, but it's a whole different thing to actually have to interact and engage with that difference rather than just be aware of it. So when it came to all those issues of managing the classroom, assessment, sort of the goals and outcomes of the class, I realized that I didn't necessarily know as well as would be helpful how to engage with the education culture of a Chinese university. So with respect to what would have been helpful for me to know, maybe being a little less prideful and kind of tapping into that foreign teacher community there, and having more of a network. for
Right, yeah.
more experienced teachers who had already been there, as well as just daily things like getting a bank account or renting an apartment. I ended up figuring all those things out on my own and practicing my Mandarin quite a bit in the process. But it would have been
Yes.
much easier and helpful to have tapped more into a network and connected to people with more experience.
Yeah, some fantastic points you raised there. And as I said again, I think many of us have gone through each one of them
Yes,
painstakingly.
right. Yeah,
It's real textbook
right.
stuff. What
Yeah.
I wanted to know but didn't know when I came to China. I think that's brilliant, that sentence. Now, Andy, of course, you came last year and you were looking, as you said, to maybe come back to China again and integrate into the culture and stay here long term. Based on those things that you've just said, your current kind of conclusion was that no, I better head back to America. How does that work? What's the current situation on that? Because you did a year
Yeah.
and you didn't want to stay on again. Was it that
Sure.
bad, or how did you, for example, get into doing data research? How does that connect with the Teach Now program, which of course offers a great program for licensing teachers, a certification
Right.
program, I guess, to do exactly these things, of course.
Yes, absolutely. So I think it was, as far as my reason for returning and then how that all connects to what I'm doing now. So I think I realized that if I was going to live in China, that I had to kind of acknowledge the realities of what that were, which is, despite my background, it's just not really quite a thing, I would say, where you can just kind of come and just be another person. You still have to, in some ways, be the foreigner. And
Sure.
perhaps that's changing, and that might change in the future. But in my experience, at least, that was still kind of a thing. So, and I don't necessarily say that negatively. That's just sort of the
Yeah.
situation. So in my mind, if I was going to be there, the way in which I was trying to be there wasn't going to be the most successful approach. So, so trying to continue to do that didn't make sense, which is why I came back. I'm still interested. It's still a
Okay.
very important place for me, and I could potentially see myself going back in the future. But at this point, if I were to do so, it would be in a more kind of established role or position, would be what I was looking for. Or in the case, if I was to go as a teacher, being much better prepared than I was. I think I could have stayed in the role I was doing, but I realized that I wasn't able to do it to a level that I was
Yeah.
satisfied with my kind of performance. So that kind of links us into Teach Now a bit. So I came back here, was looking
Yeah.
for work, and just sort of by happenstance really came across a job posting to work here at Teach Now. And initially that job posting was to be a candidate liaison position, given my sort of teaching background a little bit, as well as China background. And a lot of our candidates are in fact teaching in China. So I was hired for that, and then very quickly transitioned into this sort of research role as that need popped up again, sort of with the startup situation. And I kind of got tasked to do a thing or two, and Dr. Emily Feistreitzer, our CEO, she liked the work I did, so that kind of became the sort of new position for me. So I've been doing that the last few months. But sort of why as we sort of chatted about having a podcast here, one of the things that we chatted about with what I wish I had known, one of the things that attracted me to work at Teach Now was the program had all of those points I mentioned earlier, delivered those things very effectively. And as I was researching the company to prepare for an interview and think about whether I wanted to be working here and that kind of thing, I immediately noticed the quality of the program and that they were delivering things that I had realized I needed as a teacher, and not just delivering them, but delivering them with quality. And so that was a big reason why I decided to join Teach Now, was I really saw the quality of what they're offering. And I also saw people who were committed to making a difference in the world of teachers. So I know perhaps another time we might talk more about sort of some of the research we've been doing, as well as maybe the future of education and that kind of stuff. But I think one of the things that pops up in that general discussion is that while there's a lot of ideas and policies and research out there, not too many people stop to ask teachers what they think. When Teach Now was created, that was the foundational sort of piece upon which it was created, was what teachers say works for them. And so as I looked into the program, saw how it was developed, saw that mindset of the creators and the people working here, and saw that it really did deliver a quality program addressing those things, which I myself had experienced. That made me excited to work here. And I have to say, in the 2 or 3 months now that I've been here, I've definitely seen that ring true in the work that's done here. So that's kind of what brought me back from China, but is kind of reconnecting me with China, as many of our candidates there, as I'm working here at Teach Now.
Absolutely, Andy. Fantastic story. I love it. And to close the pod, I've got to ask you, from your China roots and experiences, what's the one thing that you're missing now you're back in Washington, D.C. from being in China? And you can't say Taobao, okay? You can't say Taobao.
Well, that's definitely a really nice one for sure. But, I think I would say two things. And one of them is personal to me, and one of them is just sort of has to do with China. So, the food. It's hard to argue with sort of you can't quite get the same quality of Chinese food when you're outside of China. Even when it's really good, it's just not quite the same. And so I definitely miss the food. On a personal note, and this may be true for many other people as well, but I do really love living in an international environment. And I love sort of the diversity, mixing with people from all different kinds of backgrounds that I wouldn't normally have mixed with otherwise, or wouldn't have so easily mixed with otherwise. And I think that really enriches one's experience. And you can do that in your home country, and I do seek to do that, but it comes a little more naturally when you're living abroad, I think. So that sort of experience of diversity and its enrichment is something that I do miss about my China days.
Yeah, I couldn't agree any more. And all those listeners out there now, whether they're teachers or whether they're working in China in another industry or in another country listening to this podcast, I'm sure that absolutely resonates with them too. And it's been lovely to have you on, and I hope we can do some more stuff in the future because, as I said, I really like the sound of data diving. This is China Jedi, people.
If you're an English-speaking teacher from anywhere in the world and you have a bachelor's degree but need an official and accredited teaching license to get a job, get a visa to teach abroad, or most importantly to learn all those things you wish you knew before you stood in front of 30-plus students, then reach now to Teach Now and secure a professional US District of Columbia license in as little as 9 months. Online in no time, low cost, high quality. Teach Now. Get in the game. Immediately receive a $100 discount off your tuition by signing up to the Teach Now program via the link www.teach-now.edu/China Jedi.
May the smile be with you.